There is only one choice: practice the Dharma. Welcome back, everyone, to Mind Podcast. There is no self to indulge. The self is formed only by mere imputation. In truth, there is nothing to cling to or to indulge. Living in delusion, all of our problems lie in the fact that we do not see the true nature of reality. Delusive thoughts are like poisonous mushrooms or opium, always causing our minds to be caught in illusions. We do not have the ability to use direct cognition to see the nature of reality, namely, that all phenomena that arise dependently are fleeting and impermanent. And fundamentally, although things appear that way, their actual existence is not as we perceive it. Our ignorant mind believes everything exists with inherent nature. When we look at the self that appears to exist, we grasp at it as inherently existent, but in fact, it is not so. In the same way, whatever we see with our ignorance, this self, body, mind, other people, the six sense objects, all of them exist, yet not in the way we think. Observe all of these delusive thoughts that cling to inherent existence. Just like an embroidered cloth covering a table, the inherently existent self obscures the merely labeled self. In your perception, the subject, the self, is entirely covered by the layer of inherent existence. Likewise, action and object appear in the same way. All are vividly displayed through the aspect of inherent existence. Look at all these things, be aware that they are empty. Focus your attention on this. Everything, subject, action, and object are all empty. Every single thing in the world is empty. Focus your attention on emptiness. In emptiness, there is no self, no other, no subject, no object, no friend, no enemy. In emptiness, there is no greed, no hatred. In emptiness, there is not even emptiness. While meditating on emptiness, while seeing emptiness, you should think in this way. Then you will understand. There is no reason, however small, to believe that anything exists independently in and of itself. The self is merely a label imputed onto the five aggregates. That self does not exist in the way ignorance perceives it. Ignorance sees that self not as a mere label, but as something that exists independently. The inherently existent nature that ignorance grasps does not exist at all. We must be clearly aware that what appears to exist as independent actually does not exist independently. Everything that exists, starting with this self, is in no way anything other than a mere label, an imputation. There is no self other than the self that is imputed. Apart from labeling, there are no aggregates, no body or mind. Likewise, actions, objects, friends, enemies, strangers, possessions. The six objects, these are all just labels imputed by mind. All of them are empty, almost as though they do not exist. And yet, all these self, action, object, friend, enemy, stranger, possessions, happiness, suffering, good, bad, praise, blame, gain, loss are not non-existent. They seem illusory, as if they do not exist, but they are not illusory, they do exist. See all of these as illusory? The things appearing before you, a truly existent self, definitely real. Actions that are definitely real, objects that are definitely real, friends, enemies, strangers, possessions, all definitively real. None of these appearances have anything to do with reality. Their seemingly solid, independently existing nature has nothing to do with the real way things are. In fact, they are completely empty. Happiness, suffering, praise, blame, pleasant or unpleasant speech, honor, disgrace, gain, loss, all of these appear real as if they exist independently, but actually they have nothing to do with reality. They do not exist in that manner. In fact, they are completely empty. Due to habitual imprints from the ignorance of inherent existence in the past, which remain on the mental continuum, we now grasp everything as inherently existing, whereas in truth they are merely labeled, merely imputed. This seed, also called a potential, remains on the mental continuum and ripens in that way. If there were no labeling, nothing could exist. The self would not exist without labeling it I. The five aggregates, samsara, nirvana, without labeling, they do not exist. Therefore, everything is empty. Everything we see as existing independently, the self, actions, objects, friends, enemies, strangers, sense objects, is entirely empty. From morning to night, everything we say is merely imputed and labeled. All our thoughts concern what is merely imputed and labeled. Everything we look at is merely imputed and labeled. From morning to night, from birth to death, from beginningless samsara until enlightenment, it is all like that. Therefore, there is no reason at all to give rise to greed, hatred, or ignorance. It is all pointless, futile, illogical, yet our mind keeps producing such useless things. Our mind gives rise to greed, hatred, ignorance. We must assert that there is no reason for these deluded, mistaken thoughts to arise. Searching for the self. None of the five aggregates is the self. Even the combination of the aggregates is not the self. The body is not the self. Even the mind is not the self. Understand thoroughly that none of these is the self. The five aggregates are the basis for labeling, and the label I is imputed upon them. But they are not the self. The self is something else. The self is not separate from the five aggregates, but it is different from them. From the top of your head down to your toes, you cannot find the self anywhere. Everything you point to is not the self. Everything you can touch from head to toe is not the self. None of these parts of the body is the self. See clearly that the self is nowhere. Contemplate in this way. If the self could be found among the aggregates, it would mean it exists inherently, with its own nature. Through analytical logic, not mere belief, you cannot find the self in these aggregates. But this does not mean that the self does not exist. There is no self in these aggregates, but there is a self. There is a self in this world, in the Root Institute Monastery here in Bodh Gaya. The self exists. Why? Because it is the self that suffers and can abandon suffering by abandoning its causes. Because it experiences suffering, the self practices the Dharma. If there were no self, life would be very simple. You literally would not have to do anything. You would not need to get up in the morning and rush out to work. You would not need to look for a job. If there were no self, why would you go to university to get a degree? None of these things would be necessary. Without a self to enjoy material comfort, why bother with all these efforts? If there were no self, why worry about this or that? You could drop everything in an instant. If there were no self, there would be no act of meditation. Without a subject, the I, how could there be the act of meditation? It would be a lie to say, I am meditating. There would be no subject, no action, and no object. However, because there is a basis for labeling the self, there is no other choice than to say a self exists. Because there is an action that causes suffering, there is no other choice than to say negative karma exists. Because there is a mental factor that agitates the primary consciousness, there is no other choice than to say delusions exist. Because there are unpleasant, uncomfortable, unpeaceful feelings, there is no other choice than to say suffering exists. Searching for other things besides the self. Similarly, when contemplating the selflessness of the person, the self, in relation to I, you can also contemplate the selflessness of the aggregates and all other existing phenomena, the selflessness of phenomena. Those not familiar with this subject might not know that the term self and selflessness can refer to anything, anyone. It is not solely for people or oneself. The aggregates are also selfless. Look at everything around here: the table, the embroidered cloth, the lamp, the wall, the curtain, the flowers, actions, objects, sense objects. You must understand that the appearance of all of these things is an illusion. Using the example of Lama Zopa, you can see that we are completely stuck in heavy illusion that has nothing to do with reality. What we see has not even the slightest connection to reality. Take the example of a table. We label table onto something whose function is to hold or support objects placed upon it. We label table onto that particular shape. mainly for that function, which is entirely dependent on that function. However, anywhere you point on the table is not the table itself. Every part, every piece of wood, the tabletop, the underside, the four legs, none of these is the table. Even the entire collection, all the parts put together so that we can place things on top, is not the table. The collection of parts is only the basis of labeling the substance, not the table itself. Therefore, on this thing, you cannot find a table. There is no table in it. But there is a table that depends on that basis of labeling. There is a table here. Looking at the basis of labeling, we cannot find the table, yet the table is there because the basis of labeling is there. But right on the basis of labeling itself, the table cannot be pointed to or found. Again, the reality of the table is completely different from what we normally see. The appearance of the table and our perception have nothing to do with the actual reality of the table. Reality is something entirely different. When we analyze what the table is, trying to see the reality of it the way it truly exists, we discover that the table is something other than what we normally cling to. From this, you can recognize the illusion. The table is merely an imputation, a concept, meaning it does not have independent existence. There is no table on this basis of labeling, but because there is a basis of labeling, the table is here. The table depends on this basis of labeling. The table is simply an idea, and the self is simply an idea. The aggregates are simply an idea. The emptiness of the five aggregates. The five aggregates are not the self. The self is merely what is imputed on the five aggregates. Therefore, the self is empty, completely empty. When we say the five aggregates, we know that the basis of labeling for the five aggregates is not in itself the five aggregates. So then, what are the five aggregates? They are nothing but a label imputed upon that basis, and thus they are completely empty. Contemplate each aggregate. 1. Form, scant rupa. The basis of labeling form is not form itself. So what is form? It is nothing but a label imputed by the mind, so form is completely empty. 2. Feeling, scant vedana. The basis of labeling feeling is not feeling, so what is feeling? It is nothing but a label, so feeling is completely empty. 3. Discrimination, sansanya. Likewise, the basis of labeling discrimination is not discrimination, it is nothing but a label. Hence, discrimination is completely empty. 4. Compositional factors, Scott. Saskara. This includes all impermanent phenomena not belonging to the other aggregates like form, feeling, discrimination, and consciousness. For example, mental factors, people, imprints, time. Again, the basis of labeling compositional factors is not compositional factors themselves. So, what are compositional factors? Nothing but a label. Thus, they are completely empty. 5. Consciousness, Saint Vijnana. The basis of labeling consciousness is not consciousness. Earlier, I defined consciousness as the basis that performs the function of cognition, but that basis is not the label consciousness. Our mind usually conflates the basis of labeling and the label itself, believing them to be one. This is what we must refute, what we must recognize as being empty, because they are empty. To our mind, the basis of labeling and the name consciousness appear as one and the same, not separate. But in reality, they are not the same, they are different. Again, the specific attributes and functions of consciousness are the basis of labeling. But consciousness itself is just a label placed on that particular basis that has specific qualities and functions. Just like the activities of the 5 aggregates are referred to as I am doing this or that, similarly the activity of that aggregate is called consciousness. Like all other aggregates, consciousness is completely empty. The emptiness of the 6 sense objects on form, visible objects. Again, the basis of labeling form is not form. Form is something different from its basis. So what is form? It is nothing but a label imputed by the mind, so form is completely empty. All that we call form is completely empty. In our mind, form is not different from the basis of labeling form. When we see a bamboo rod, we label form onto it. But for us, the basis of labeling and form appear as one. We see the basis of labeling and form as one and inseparable. That is precisely what we must refute. We fail to notice the arising of inherent existence. We see form not as merely labeled, but as something that exists independently. The moment we see or think about the bamboo rod, instantly the basis of labeling and the rod appear as one in our mind. I am not talking about those who no longer see inherent existence, but about those who do not realize that the basis of labeling and the label rod are separate. Hence, the object to be refuted appears in just this way. When we see form, in actuality, we see the basis of labeling, not form. Form is only a labeled phenomenon. The basis of labeling is not form, the phenomenon that is labeled. So, what is form? It is nothing but a label imputed by the mind. Thus, form is completely empty. 2. Sound. Similarly, there is a basis of labeling, and we label it sound, pleasant sound, unpleasant sound, praise, criticism, etc. Again, the words we call sound are actually not the label sound. So what is sound? It is nothing but a label imputed by the mind. Hence, sound is completely empty. 3. Odor. This is the object of the nose, sense of smell, labeled odor. Whatever the nose can smell that other sense faculties cannot is called the basis of labeling. That is not the label odor. It is not the phenomenon that is labeled odor. So what is odor? Nothing but a label imputed by the mind, therefore odor is completely empty. 4. Taste. Similarly, taste is labeled onto whatever the tongue perceives that the other sense faculties do not. Its basis of labeling is not the label taste. Taste exists only as an imputation, so it is completely empty. 5. Tactile objects. The same applies here. Tactile objects is labeled onto whatever the body's sense of touch perceives that the other sense faculties do not. Tactile objects exist as mere labels, therefore they are entirely empty. The emptiness of the Four Noble Truths. 1. The truth of suffering. Dukkha. This includes 3 types of suffering: suffering of suffering, suffering of change, pervasive suffering. All are simply labeled by the mind, so the truth of suffering is completely empty, as if it does not exist. 2. The truth of the origin of suffering. Samudaya. It is imputed upon karma and mental afflictions, delusions. Thus, the truth of origin is completely empty, as if it does not exist. 3. The truth of cessation, nirvana, or liberation, is the state in which the continuity of consciousness has abandoned the obstacles caused by delusional states. This truth of cessation is nothing other than a mental label, so it is entirely empty, as if it does not exist. 4. The truth of the path, marga. This refers to the wisdom that directly perceives emptiness. Since the path is nothing but a label imputed by the mind, it does not exist independently. All suffering, origin, cessation, path are merely labeled by the mind. Thus, they do not inherently or independently exist. When you meditate on the essence of wisdom, you should reflect on each aggregate and each sense object one by one. Apply the reasoning that each point is empty because it is merely labeled. In this way, you will naturally feel its emptiness. Abide in the emptiness. The more deeply you understand the subtle dependent arising in mere labeling, the more deeply you will understand emptiness. This is the true nature of things. When we cultivate mindfulness of this, we enter a different realm. But when we do not see reality, we live a life with an inherently existent self, which never existed, in an inherently existent world, which never existed. When we fail to see reality, we live our lives grasping at an inherently existent self, which never existed. That leads an inherently existent life in an inherently existent world. We believe in the real existence of the self, which never existed, with inherently existent aggregates, which never existed, and objects of forms, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile objects as inherently existent, which never existed. We believe in the real, independently existing suffering, which never existed, and the real cause of suffering, which never existed. We conceive negative karma as truly existing, independent, and separate, which never existed, and think of liberation as truly existing, independent, which never existed. We think of the truly existing path we are meditating on, which never existed. Always see reality. Bodhisattva Togme Zangpo said, "Even though I may sit here on a Dharma throne and speak extensively about emptiness, if someone praises or criticizes me, my mind becomes immediately disturbed. Even if I can say, all appearances have no inherent nature, still attachment and aversion arise over a few words of praise or blame. Not even slightly can this be called the middle way." You may be able to recite by heart and give excellent explanations of all of the Madhyamaka teachings by Nagarjuna, all the profound commentaries on wisdom by Lama Tsongkhapa, or all the perfection of wisdom teachings, but in daily life. If your mind is unsettled by even the slightest praise or blame, it shows you are not stable. Attachment and aversion instantly flare up. If this happens in your mind every day, then you are not practicing correctly by no means at all. You should be aware that all of these truly existing phenomena, all these appearances of independent existence, are empty. Understand that they are illusion-like, meaning they are empty. In short, all dependently arisen phenomena are transient and impermanent by nature and empty by their very nature. In daily life, if you do not practice this mindfulness, your mind will be overrun by illusions and false conceptions, like a city overwhelmed by floodwaters. The mind is dominated by delusive thoughts, delusive images, delusive beliefs. As long as the mind remains submerged in delusion, genuine peace cannot arise. Life is steeped in illusion. The fundamental illusion is the failure to see that all things are illusion-like. Those who do not see emptiness, who do not see phenomena as illusion-like, not only see everything as inherently existent when in reality it is illusion-like, but they also have a very difficult problem in stubbornly clinging to the belief that everything is truly real. This delusional thought, this ignorance, is the root of all other mistaken states, which then affects karma. Karma, in turn, plants seeds in the continuum of consciousness, forming the causes for cyclic existence. Likewise, the ignorant mind, grasping everything as inherently existent, continually binds you to samsara, causing you to experience the three types of suffering life after life. Moreover, it prevents you from achieving liberation and enlightenment, stopping you from fulfilling the wish to bring all sentient beings to the highest happiness and complete enlightenment. Following this ignorant mind yields no benefit whatsoever for self or others and only harm. It is childish to trust in this ignorance when, in fact, there has never been such inherently existent phenomena. By nature, everything is empty. Nothing possesses inherent existence, so holding to them as real simply because they appear real is illogical, pointless, and incorrect. This ignorance causes immense harm. There is no reason to pursue the ignorant mind that clings to everything as inherently existent, or to trust that appearance of inherent existence. And there is no benefit in allowing the deluded thoughts of greed and hatred to arise. There is no self to indulge. In reality, the self is completely empty, so there is nothing to pamper. Realize that the self is empty, then check if there is anything to indulge. Since the self that exists is nothing more than a label, there is nothing to cling to or fuss over. When you examine carefully, you will see that self-cherishing is totally absurd and only creates problems. Even though you do not want problems, you create them yourself. Self-cherishing is domineering. Because of its domination, you try to protect the self, which in turn leads to many problems and failures. This is entirely illogical. Examine, why do I indulge in myself? Why do I consider myself more important than countless other sentient beings? Why do I think I am so precious? There is no valid reason to hold such a self-centered attitude. We can find countless reasons why we should care for others, while we cannot find a single reason why we should spoil ourselves. The self is not that important or precious. Just like you, all other sentient beings want happiness and do not want suffering. Sentient beings are numberless, while you are just one. The importance of the self vanishes when you reflect on innumerable other sentient beings. The self means nothing. Even if you are reborn in hell, it is only one person, so it is not such a big deal. Even if you attain liberation from samsara, it is still only one person, so there is nothing to be excited about. When you think of the countless other sentient beings just like yourself wanting happiness and not wanting suffering, you see that your personal self is completely insignificant. Therefore, in your daily life, there is nothing more worthwhile than serving others and caring for all of them. With that attitude, dedicate your entire body, speech, and mind for the sake of sentient beings. In life, there is nothing more important than this. There is only one choice: practice the Dharma. Because you do not want problems, there is only one choice. You must practice the Dharma. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often advises that the best way to lead this life is to live in solitude, renouncing worldly life and the 8 worldly concerns, single-mindedly meditating on the step-by-step path to enlightenment. To cultivate the realizations that lead to enlightenment is best, yet not everyone can do this. For those who cannot live in such solitude but who have knowledge of the Dharma, the second option is to teach the Dharma to others. Though this option does not allow for complete renunciation, one can practice as much as possible according to one's capacity while instructing others. The third case: if someone does not have sufficient Dharma knowledge to teach others, they can still practice Dharma as much as possible within their capacity and serve others in society. There is no other option. Because you do not want to suffer, there is no other option. You must practice Dharma. This is certain. Dharma is the only means to end problems and bring peace to the mind. There is no other solution if you do not want suffering apart from practicing Dharma. Practicing Dharma means giving up the causes of problems that come from the mind and creating the causes of happiness which also come from the mind. All the problems of this life and future lives stem from non-virtuous karma and self-centered thoughts, and from the root cause, the ignorance that holds the self to be truly existent. If you want to cease facing problems now and in the future, you must purify the negative karma you have already accumulated and stop creating new negative karma. That is the practice of Dharma. This is how you solve life's problems. For example, if someone has an incurable illness and cannot recover by normal means, it means their obstacles are great. Generally, the only way for them to recover is through intense Dharma practice with strong focus. If they have the good karma to meet a Lama who can teach them the appropriate methods of meditation and Dharma, they can recover. There have been many cases like this. Some people cannot be cured by medicine for a long time, but later they practice the Dharma and get well. Some have healed cancer through meditation practice. One of my father's brothers had been ill for many years. He went to Tibet, consulted many doctors, but without result. Finally, he went to see a meditator in Chirac near Lawudo Cave, where I sometimes visit. The meditator told him his illness was due to very heavy karmic obstacles, so he had to do extensive purification. He received instruction to do preliminary practices like prostrations, refuge, etc. from that meditator and also from another older meditator in Chirac. While doing these preliminary practices, my uncle gradually regained his health. He ended up making 700,000 prostrations. During that time, he also took care of my grandmother, who was blind. He prepared food for her, took her outside for the toilet, and did many other tasks. He did this for many years to care for her. Many stories like this exist. When external measures, such as medicine, fail to solve problems, we use internal methods, taking refuge, practicing Dharma. We must practice Dharma not only to avoid future suffering, but also to end our current problems. In brief, we must practice Dharma. Whether you are Buddhist or not, there is no alternative to solve problems and prevent them from happening again. You must practice Dharma regardless of how many problems you have. Even if you cannot find the time to do long retreats or deep studies, you can still do something to practice Dharma, because you do not want suffering and misery. Even if you have problems like illness or difficulty with loved ones, you cannot use that as an excuse to stop practicing Dharma. You must make an effort to practice Dharma. Even if right now you do not have the karma to live in solitude like some practitioners who completely renounce worldly life, you should always aspire to do so. Do not think, since I cannot live like that, these teachings are useless to me. There is great benefit. Although you cannot do it now, generating the aspiration to have such conditions in the future will plant the seed, creating the cause for pure Dharma practice, for a life of solitude, and for renouncing the 8 worldly concerns. This is how you can succeed in actualizing the path to enlightenment. Reading and studying the Lamrim, the stages of the path, is extremely important. Even if you have studied the Madhyamakavatara, Chandraki Arti's commentary on the Middle Way, the Abhisamayalakara, Maitreya's commentary on Emptiness, the qualities of a Buddha, and the path to Buddhahood, and other philosophical treatises extensively without paying attention to the Lamrim, you will not know the meaning of worldly Dharma. You will still make the mistake of thinking that only a few actions are truly worldly unless you have read manuals like Opening the Door of Dharma, which teaches foundational preliminary practices. Understanding these practices is certainly helpful for your cultivation. Each day, we have countless opportunities to practice renunciation, accumulate merit, and progress toward enlightenment. Every day, we can accumulate vast merit through daily protective deity practices. There are many aspects to these practices: the motivation at the beginning, making offerings, visualizing the Yidam deity and emptiness, and so forth. Even completing one sadhana accumulates enormous merit. Meditating on emptiness for even a moment purifies heavy negative karma from among the 10 non-virtuous deeds. It is said that just wanting to meditate on emptiness purifies those negative karmas and accumulates immense merit. Similarly, even the wish to hear the Prajnaparamita teachings purifies negative karma created in many past lives. As stated in A Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, Bodhicaryavatara, meditating on bodhicitta has immeasurable power for purification. It is one of the most powerful purification methods. Concerning the accumulation of vast merit, bodhicitta is the most skillful method. I believe that the Dharma practices explained in Opening the Door of Dharma are very important. They are the main refuge in daily life and extremely effective for the mind. They help prevent every kind of problem. Reading, contemplating deeply, and especially practicing Opening the Door of Dharma is the solution to problems. It is especially helpful for householders, particularly when you feel your life is like hell, experiencing so much distress you want to commit suicide. You cannot and should not spend your entire life chasing endless desires. Such a life is overwhelming and constantly unhappy if you let it be controlled by desire and the 8 worldly concerns, bringing misery to yourself and others. Right here in the human realm, you create a kind of hell even before being reborn in the hell realms. Not only do you become unhappy yourself, you also bring many others down, causing them problems. Certainly, there is no doubt that practicing the Dharma is the true refuge in life. Training the mind brings peace not just to yourself, but also to others. When your mind is peaceful and harmonious, you do not obstruct others' lives in practice. Mind training is also crucial for those who want to practice the Lamrim path. Without mind training, you cannot develop along the stages to enlightenment. When you train your mind to abandon the 8 worldly concerns, it naturally paves the way for advancement in the Lamrim path. I find it especially vital for those who do short or long-term retreats. Mind training is the main support for retreat, helping to keep the mind calm and cut through obstacles, leading to success in retreat. For monastics, I believe mind training is essential. Without it, monks and nuns cannot continue upholding their vows. It will be difficult to maintain them. Furthermore, it is a primary means to develop the mind and achieve the realizations of the Lamrim path. In particular, for monks and nuns, these teachings form the foundation of your practice, to be heard and read repeatedly, to be remembered, and used as your main refuge and protection. In conclusion, we must value Dharma practice and not allow deluded thoughts to occupy our mind. Whether you have few or many problems, you still need to practice Dharma. You must practice Dharma. You must try your best. By abandoning desire once, twice, 3 or 4 times a day, you avoid creating that negative karma. It prevents all sorts of other negative thoughts from arising. You need to practice Dharma even just to maintain peace of mind each day, each moment. Meditate on impermanence and death as the basis, and train your mind according to the Lamrim. Endeavor to accumulate merit and purify negative karma as much as possible. Determination to practice. Even if we have time to do some Dharma practice, our thoughts tainted by the 8 worldly concerns will keep our practice from becoming pure Dharma. This leads to laziness and postponement of practice. It weakens our mind, preventing us from generating strong determination to practice. Everything comes down to determination. Without determination, there is no development at all. My first teacher, whose Dharma name was Akayu Lekshi, the one I mentioned earlier who taught me the alphabet, used to tell me that every problem lies in not deciding firmly to practice Dharma. He told me this when I first started to learn letters. And the last time we met, before he passed away, he repeated this teaching when speaking about the Dharma. Not deciding firmly to practice becomes the source of all problems and obstacles. It is your mind that creates these difficulties. It is your mind that hinders your practice, makes it hard to develop realizations on the path. If you establish determination, there will be no difficulties. If you do not, there will be difficulties. The path itself does not pose obstacles. Dharma does not pose difficulties. Difficulties in Dharma practice come from your own mind, from not having sufficient resolve. The 8 worldly concerns prevent you from forming a clear determination. When you detach yourself from that erroneous mindset of the 8 worldly concerns, there is no difficulty. When you live in friendship with the 8 worldly concerns, you will experience difficulty. No Dharma itself is inherently difficult. There is no truly existing difficulty. Your mind creates the trouble. There is nothing more than your lack of determination to practice. If right now you have the capacity to firmly decide to abandon desire and immediately put Dharma into practice, you will have peace of mind. Right here on this seat, in this very moment, if you choose, you can find peace. Without determination, you will not have peace. If you establish determination, peace is something you can experience right now, in this moment. There is no other choice, no other solution.